"I'm going to make sure you lose this house, Mr. Chen," Victoria Morgan smirked, taping the eviction notice to my door. "Next time, you'll think twice before breaking HOA rules." I clenched my fists as our Millionaire HOA manager clicked away in her designer heels. She'd made her fortune flipping luxury properties before deciding to rule our middle-class neighborhood like a tyrant. And now she was threatening to evict me over some law books in my living room. What Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. I would be sworn in as the district judge whose first assignment was overseeing HOA dispute cases, including hers. Through my blinds, I watched Victoria doing her morning inspection in her designer pantsuit and red-bottomed heels, taking photos of my house for the fourth time this week. Everyone knew Victoria had made millions flipping luxury properties before deciding to retire into managing our middle-class community like her personal kingdom. "Maybe we should just move your law books to the basement," my wife Emma suggested. "No," I said firmly. "We're not hiding my professional materials like we're doing something wrong. That desk is in our living room, not a storefront." Victoria wanted to play hardball over some books. In exactly 24 hours, she'd learn who really had the final say when she tried to take me to court. That HOA meeting last week replayed in my mind constantly. Victoria hadn't even looked up from her gold-plated pen as I tried to explain my situation. "Rules are rules, Mr. Chen," she'd said with a dismissive wave. "Section 8.3 clearly prohibits home businesses. Maybe if you need a commercial office space, this residential neighborhood isn't for you." The smirk on her face made it clear this wasn't about rules, this was about power. I watched her approach Mr. Patterson's house, meticulously measuring his hedges with a tape measure. Poor Mr. Patterson had been threatened with $2,500 in liens last month for hedges that were too asymmetrical and disrupting neighborhood aesthetic harmony. His retirement savings couldn't handle another fine. My phone buzzed. A text from the court administrator. "Orientation complete. Your courtroom assignment has been finalized. District 7. Property litigation and civil disputes." Victoria power walked toward me, leather portfolio clutched to her chest, oversized designer sunglasses hiding her eyes. "Mr. Chen," she called out, voice sickly sweet. "I trust you received our notice about your home business violation?" "I did, Victoria, and I have some questions about the legal basis for this eviction threat." I kept my voice calm and professional. "The board has full authority to enforce residential-only zoning." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "The books, desk and computer clearly visible through your front window constitute a home office. Perhaps if you attended more meetings, you'd understand how these things work." As she turned to leave, her designer heels clicking on the sidewalk, she called over her shoulder, "Oh, and the board is meeting with our attorneys tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp. We'll be finalizing the eviction filing against your property." She checked her diamond-studded watch. "You have exactly 24 hours to remove all business items before we proceed legally." What Victoria didn't know was that I'd been quietly documenting her reign of terror for years. The Rodriguez family forced to park their work trucks 3 blocks away. Mrs. Patel denied a wheelchair ramp for her elderly father because it disrupted architectural coherence. The Singh family fined for excessive cooking odors during their religious holiday. My neighbors suffered silently, afraid of Victoria's legal threats and financial power. They didn't know how to fight back, but I did. I pulled out my phone to text the court administrator. "Could you move up my swearing in to tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. instead of next week? Something urgent has come up." Just then, I noticed Mrs. Gonzalez across the street, removing her ethnically inconsistent garden gnomes as Victoria supervised with her clipboard. Mrs. Gonzalez caught my eye, her expression a mixture of shame and helplessness. My gaze shifted to the framed photo on my wall, my parents standing proudly in front of their small business before they lost everything fighting an unjust property dispute 20 years ago. Mom and Dad had taught me to use the law to protect people, not to bully them. I spread my research across the dining table, each HOA bylaw violation carefully highlighted and annotated with relevant precedents. 3 years of Victoria's selective enforcement, documented with photos, dates, and witness statements. Is that enough evidence? Emma asked, setting down a cup of coffee beside me. I nodded. More than enough. And tomorrow, Victoria Morgan is going to learn the true meaning of legal authority. I couldn't sleep that night. The grandfather clock in our hallway seemed to be counting down the hours until my confrontation with Victoria. At 5:30 a.m., I gave up trying and quietly dressed in my best suit, the one I'd been saving for my official swearing-in next week. "Today's the day?" Emma asked, her voice still thick with sleep. I nodded, adjusting my tie. "Today's the day justice finally comes to Oakwood Estates." The courthouse was quiet at 7:30 a.m., just a few early-arriving clerks preparing for the day ahead. Judge Williams met me at the entrance, a knowing smile on his face. "Heard you had a situation that couldn't wait," he said, gesturing toward the ceremonial courtroom. "Fastest judicial swearing-in I've approved in 20 years. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, as I placed my hand on the law book and recited the oath to uphold justice. I thought of every neighbor who'd been bullied by Victoria's reign. "Congratulations, Judge Chen," the court administrator said, handing me my robes. "Your chambers are ready, and your first docket begins at 9:30. I reviewed the morning's case files as I settled into my new office, and there it was, right on schedule. Morgan H.O.A. Management versus Chen, 9:30 a.m. Victoria had indeed wasted no time filing the emergency eviction injunction. Through my chamber window, I could see Victoria arriving in her luxury car, checking her reflection in a compact mirror before strutting toward the courthouse entrance. Her expensive lawyer followed, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than some of my neighbors' monthly mortgage payments. "Your Honor," my clerk said, poking her head in. "Ms. Morgan and her attorney are requesting to meet with the presiding judge before the hearing." I smiled. "Tell them the judge will see them in the courtroom at 9:30, not a minute before." My heart pounded as I donned the black robes. For a moment I questioned whether this was about justice or personal revenge. Then I remembered Mr. Patterson's hedges, Mrs. Patel's father struggling to enter their home without a ramp, and the Rodriguez family walking 3 blocks in the rain to reach their work trucks. No, this wasn't revenge. This was accountability. At exactly 9:30, I nodded to the bailiff. The courtroom doors opened, and Victoria strutted in confidently, whispering something to her attorney that made them both chuckle. "All rise," the bailiff announced. "Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Michael Chen presiding." I walked into courtroom 7 through the judge's chambers, my new robes feeling both foreign and perfectly right. I kept my eyes on my paperwork as the bailiff called the court to order, not yet looking up to meet Victoria's gaze. "Calling case number 47293, Morgan H.O.A. Management versus Chen, motion for emergency injunction and eviction proceedings," the clerk announced. Only then did I raise my head. The look on Victoria's face was worth every moment of stress leading up to this day. Her jaw physically dropped, designer purse slipping from her manicured fingers to the floor with a thud that echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. The color drained from her face as recognition dawned. Your Honor," she stuttered, "there appears to be some confusion." "No confusion, Ms. Morgan," I replied calmly. "I am indeed Judge Michael Chen, recently appointed to District 7 overseeing property litigation and civil disputes." I gestured to the case file. "Including homeowners association matters." Victoria's attorney leaned over, whispering urgently in her ear. I could see panic replacing her usual arrogance. Your Honor, the attorney spoke up. We respectfully request an immediate continuance due to the obvious conflict of interest in this case. A valid concern, Counselor, I acknowledged, which is precisely why I've already recused myself from hearing this specific case. I gestured to the door where Judge Williams waited. My colleague, Judge Williams, will preside over your eviction request against me. Relief flooded Victoria's face, but it was premature. However, I continued, as the newly appointed judge overseeing all HOA dispute cases in this district, I should inform you that my first administrative action this morning was to order a comprehensive review of your HOA's legal compliance. Victoria's attorney paled. On what grounds? I opened a drawer and pulled out 3 thick folders. These 27 separate complaints from homeowners in your community alleging selective enforcement, arbitrary application of rules, and potentially discriminatory practices. I set them on the bench with a weighty thud. All predating my residency there, I might add. Victoria found her voice again. This is a blatant abuse of power. You're clearly doing this for personal reasons. Actually, Ms. Morgan, I replied evenly, these investigations were initiated by my predecessor. I'm merely continuing them as part of my official duties. I nodded to the bailiff, who wheeled in a cart with 3 additional boxes of files. What are those? Victoria demanded, her voice rising an octave. Those would be the financial audits we're conducting on all HOAs in the district, I explained. Yours seem to have some irregularities that flagged it for priority review. Specifically, homeowner fees designated for community improvements that appear to have been deposited into personal investment accounts. Victoria's lawyer was now frantically shuffling through papers, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. This is harassment, Victoria hissed, but her confident demeanor had crumbled completely. This is due process, Ms. Morgan, I corrected her. Something you might want to familiarize yourself with before your hearing with Judge Williams. I stood, gathering my papers. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other cases requiring my attention. As I exited, I heard Victoria's lawyer urgently advising her to withdraw the eviction filing immediately. That evening, I drove home with a strange mixture of exhaustion and elation. As I turned onto our street, I saw an unusual gathering on my front lawn. For a moment, I feared Victoria had somehow escalated the situation. But then I noticed the smiles and heard the spontaneous applause as I parked. Mr. Patterson approached first, his eyes shining with hope. Is it true? Did you really shut down Victoria's eviction threat and launch an investigation into the HOA? Word traveled fast in our community. I nodded, setting down my briefcase. I recused myself from my own case, of course, but yes, as the new district judge overseeing HOA disputes, I'll be ensuring that all homeowners associations in our jurisdiction are following proper legal procedures. The crowd erupted in cheers. Mrs. Gonzalez stepped forward with her previously banned garden gnomes now proudly displayed in a gift basket. We've been waiting for someone to stand up to Victoria for years. Just then, a luxury car pulled up to the curb. The crowd fell silent as Victoria stepped out. Gone was the perfectly polished property manager from this morning. Her designer suit was wrinkled, her makeup smudged, and her usually immaculate hair disheveled. The neighbors parted silently as she approached my porch, the clicking of her heels somehow less confident than before. For a tense moment, no one spoke. Then Victoria cleared her throat. Judge Chen, she said formally, on behalf of the HOA, I'd like to formally withdraw all complaints against your property. She handed me an envelope with trembling fingers. We've also scheduled an emergency board meeting to reassess our bylaw enforcement policies. Thank you, Ms. Morgan, I replied professionally. I'm sure the court will be watching the results of that meeting with great interest. 2 weeks later, Victoria's luxury car was replaced by a moving truck. The financial audit had revealed years of misappropriated funds, resulting in her resignation and a complete restructuring of our HOA board with democratic elections and transparent oversight. Mr. Patterson's asymmetrical roses bloomed freely. Mrs. Patel's father finally had his wheelchair ramp, and the Rodriguez family could park their work trucks in their own driveway without fear of fines. As I watered my front garden one evening, I saw Victoria loading the last of her belongings. Our eyes met briefly across the street. I gave her a small nod, not out of malice, but as a reminder that justice, while sometimes slow, eventually arrives. That evening, I ran my fingers along the law books on my living room shelf, now displayed even more prominently than before. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "You made the news again." Attached was a link to an article titled, "Reformed Judge Transforms HOA, Practices Across County." I smiled, thinking of my parents and how proud they would be to see that their son had found a way to use the law as it was intended, not as a weapon for the powerful, but as a shield for everyday people.